I just have to say it is such a privilege to host Helen Thorpe at Politics and Prose, tonight being no exception. I think many of you know she's a prize-winning journalist and author. Her work has appeared in publications ranging from The New Yorker to The New York Times, the Texas Monthly. She also has done radio reporting or commentary, including stories on This American Life on NPR. Tonight, she is going to be talking about her wonderful third book. It's called The Newcomers, Finding Refuge, Friendship, and Hope in an American Classroom. And with all of the static and background noise and sometimes foreground noise across our country, and especially here in Washington, about immigration policy and refugees, the evolving role of newcomers in our society, there is no more important book to be reading right now, no more timely book than Helen's. She is a master of cutting through the Washington dramas and sound effects and focusing on the human story that is so often obscured by the policies and politics we read about and hear about on a daily, and I think at the moment on an hourly, if not minute by minute, tweeted basis. And like both of her first two books, I don't have any of you read her earlier books, which are fantastic. If you haven't, you must. But like both of them, The Newcomers is about people in transition. In this case, it's about children who've arrived in this country as refugees, usually from conflict or war zones, often having had serious lapses in their schooling and with virtually no resources. These are children who now must transition to a new place, a new culture, and a new system. And I think, at least from my perspective, what separates Helen's work from so many other journalists is that she settles for nothing less than full immersion into her subject. She spends time, real time, not superficial time, real time with the people she's writing about. She listens, she doesn't judge. She just works so very hard to understand what it is like experientially, emotionally, psychologically for people faced with the enormous challenge of cultural adaptation, people faced with misconceptions and biases about who they are as human beings, who must navigate really tricky terrain in order just to survive and hopefully thrive in these daunting new environments. There's such extraordinary humanity in the way she approaches her reporting and carries it out. And I also think what's very, very satisfying about her work, and this new book is certainly representative of that, is that the stories she tells are not just stories of trial and tribulation, but also stories of human resilience, creativity, and innovation. So I know you will be fascinated and moved as you read this book about the year she spent in room 142 at South High School in Denver, the kids, the teachers, the families, the relatives and friends left behind in refugee camps and or countries of origin. I probably sound like I am prone to hyperbole, but honestly, I'm really not. That said, as a disclaimer, it is not an exaggeration to say that The Newcomers is a real masterpiece of narrative nonfiction. Helen, you are 3 for 3. So each of your books has been relevant, of consequence, and represents an important contribution to how we all should be thinking about the world around us and people who are different from us. So thank you for this latest installment, and please join me in welcoming Helen Thorpe to Politics and Prose.
It is so wonderful to be here, and in my hometown, my home away from home is our local independent bookstore, the Tattered Cover, and I always feel when I come here, Lissa, that you guys have continued the same kind of legacy with this store, and it's really meaningful for me to get the chance to be here, and I really appreciate it. And authors depend on bookstores like this one. I think especially when you write books about challenging subjects and books that require a reader to think, we depend on people hand selling, as I know you guys do so brilliantly, and I'm really grateful. It's really wonderful that you guys are here. I see old friends in the room and people I've known for a really long time, and strangers, which is great. Friends I haven't met yet. Thank you guys for coming out. I'm going to take a moment to just describe how this book came to be and try to say what I attempt in the book. Then I want to read to you from a passage that's one of my favorite passages And then I really want to leave quite a bit of time for conversation. I feel like in the Q&A is really when interesting things happen. So you can be thinking of questions you might have as I go. As Lissa mentioned, my background's in journalism, and yet this project kind of almost required me to stop being a journalist. And I want to explain what I mean about when I say that. This book came about in a funny way. I had left behind the world of weekly journalism and monthly journalism. I had been working on books for a little while. My first book had been about undocumented students growing up here in the United States and what that psychological reality was like. I was looking for a new project, and I tend to do background interviews when I'm not sure exactly how to settle on a subject. And I walked into South High School in Denver, Colorado, and I said to the principal there, Kristen Waters, longtime, very charismatic leader, that I was really interested in learning more about refugees and resettlement. And she took one look at me and said, I read your first book, and you're welcome to spend as much time as you want here. And that was like the whole conversation. It happened really fast. And I was really taken aback because as a journalist, I'm really used to, that doesn't happen. You are not welcomed into buildings like schools, and people don't give you just full access to the students that they're really tending to and caring for. Because journalists are not always very good about handling situations like that, maybe in the best way. So it was just really fascinating that happened. It caught me off guard. I wasn't planning to write a book about South High School or anything happening inside the building. I didn't really even know what was happening inside the building completely. But this principal, I think, she understood that she was making a marriage happen. She knew who I was as a journalist. She'd seen the work that I had done, but much more importantly, she knew who her kids were. And she understood that she had extraordinary stories and extraordinary storytellers in her building, and that they would melt my heart. And that I would be changed by the experience as she had been and as her staff had been. And she understood that she just put us together, that something would happen, that she couldn't entirely control or predict, but that she really wanted to facilitate. So it was an extraordinary level of trust in me, but also an extraordinary level of trust in her students, that they would rise to the occasion and I would rise to the occasion. And I thought it was very daring of her, really, to say to a journalist, come spend a year here. The teacher that she introduced me to, Eddie Williams, who I invited me into his room for a full year, was really unsure about this proposition at the outset. He didn't show it. He's way too polite. But he did confide in me later on that he wasn't really sure about how this was going to go. And I felt for him because he was going to have a journalist in his classroom for an entire year. And I know that had to be daunting for him, but he was very, very gracious about it. But for the first couple months, honestly, I just sat in this room saying, can I make this happen? Because I do not understand what I'm watching. Here's this really talented teacher at the front of the room, and he's going around saying very simple things like, hi, my name is Eddie Williams. What's your name? Where are you from? And he would say that over and over to each student, and you would practice these basic greetings, and the kids were just silent. And this went on for weeks, and I was just scratching my head saying, can you write about a room where there's no dialogue? How do you get to know kids who aren't speaking? Is there a drama happening here? How would I describe that drama? How would a reader get engaged with this silent room? And it was just really puzzling for me. And I had these phone calls with my longtime editor in New York where I would describe this room to him, room 142, and he would say, I just think you should stay there and see what happens. And of course, by the end of the school year, the room had utterly transformed, and it had grown from just 5 kids at the outset to 22. There were 14 languages represented, 5 alphabets. This one teacher, by the end of the year, had managed to succeed in teaching all these 22 kids who spoke 14 languages and couldn't even speak to one another generally. He had taught all of them basic English in the present tense and the past tense. And just witnessing how that happened was truly, truly a miracle, I thought, how one teacher could handle that kind of a situation. But equally tremendous to see was just the kids blossoming, their personalities coming out as they slowly began to feel safe and understand that they were in a secure place, sometimes for the first time in their lives, and that there were other people in the room who were equally lonely when they walked in and equally interested in friendship. And just to watch these very lonely, very isolated kids just become a room of great warmth and friendship and teasing and flirting and everything that teenagers do was so, so fun to watch. And there was so much humor and laughter and everything in the room by the end of the year. It was just an utter transformation from one kind of classroom to a very, very, very different room. And I really, really felt totally privileged to witness this and to watch it. But what I mean when I say that I had to learn how not to be a journalist was if I had started out going around the room, sort of grabbing these kids and grilling them with a lot of questions, I would have gotten nowhere. And I did have good instincts, and I did know that probably wasn't the thing to do. So after just observing the room for almost half of a school year, I began to bring in interpreters. And I met with every student in the room and explained who I was in their home language and invited them to talk to me. And then if they seemed like they wanted to share their story, I asked them if I could meet their parents. And ultimately, it was really the parents who chose to kind of tell me some of the family journeys. As this was happening, this very, very skilled teacher was looking at me and saying, there's something wrong about having this journalist in the room. So he came up to me about midway through the year, just as I was hiring the interpreters and getting to know the students better. And he said, I'm going to start to involve you in the room and let you work with these kids. And I was like, oh, no. I'm a journalist. We don't do that. I'm very objective. I have to have a distance. I can't possibly, participate in this classroom in that way. It would be confusing for the students. It would be confusing for me. And he said, well, that's fine, but I'm building community in this room, and I want you to work with the kids. So I was like, okay, I'm going to have to talk to my editor about this. But I might be able to do that. I can kind of see what you're saying. It's off-putting having this woman with a notebook in the room. He's like, yeah, not working for me. So I said, okay, and went back and just talked with my editor, and we agreed that really there was something wrong with the idea that I would be emotionally uninvolved in what was happening in this room, and that the book would be richer and better if I were to just walk into the room as a full human being, not just in my journalist guise, but as a mom with a 15-year-old, same age as all these kids in this room, as a human being interested in just all the moral questions of the day, and as somebody just emotional and empathetic who's deeply moved by the courage and bravery of these kids starting over in a new country where they know nobody and they can't understand a word anybody is saying, showing up every day and being ready to try and start anew. Finally, what I came to see was that the book would benefit if I wrote myself into the book and talked about all of this. And essentially just chose to be kind of humble and play the role of, say, the ugly American, or the person who doesn't really understand the room at first and doesn't really know even that some of these languages exist and hasn't been to each one of these countries. And if I would just allow the kids to educate me and their parents to educate me, and if I could acknowledge as I went along that a lot of these families know a heck of a lot more than I do. Many of them are speaking 5 and 6 languages. So ostensibly, this is a book about a teacher and 22 refugee and immigrant students. But in some ways, it's also a book about being American and how little we know, and coming to appreciate that. So I'm going to just read to you from a passage where I visit a family at home. And it's where I kind of really cast myself in this role of the American who doesn't really understand. For the first time in the book. This chapter is called Have You Seen War? And I'm visiting the home of 2 boys in the classroom. Their names are Solomon and Methuselah. They're from the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's my first visit to their home. And the 2 boys are the kids in the room who are just blowing me away. They are learning faster than anybody else in the room. And I'm wondering who is raising these children. I've never seen learning at this kind of a curve. It's very extraordinary. Ultimately, at the end of the school year, their teacher will recommend they skip a year and a half of instruction. And in year 2, I watch them start reading To Kill a Mockingbird. So these boys were just on this trajectory like nothing I'd ever seen. I didn't know it was possible to learn as much as I witnessed them learn. At about 9 o'clock one Saturday morning, I knocked on the door of the rented house on Wabash Street where I believed Solomon and Methuselah were living. Nobody answered. The house had a weathered, clapboard exterior, painted tan, not recently, and the yard was filled with dried brown leaves flung over bare dirt. I lived less than 10 minutes away, but on the other side of Colfax Avenue, an economic dividing line in this part of the city. I knocked again, but it seemed nobody was home. I knocked a 3rd time, more loudly. Suddenly the front door swung open, and a small girl stood before me wearing a green silk party dress with sequins and a large bow. The dress was a little grubby. "Hello there," I said to the girl. "Is this the house where Solomon and Methuselah live?" "No," the girl in the party dress said emphatically. The boys had written down the address. I double-checked the number of the house. It seemed correct. "Solomon doesn't live here?" I ventured. "No," she said. She spoke with confidence. "Okay, I'm sorry. Maybe I'm at the wrong house. Do you have a brother named Solomon?" "Oh, Solomon," she said, brightening. "Yes, he's right here." She pronounced her brother's name with a British accent, so it sounded quite different from the way I'd been saying it. The girl said her name was Sifa, and I learned eventually this meant praise in Swahili. She was Solomon's sister. Soon a bevy of small children flocked around my knees. 2 girls with bright yellow hair ribbons took me by the hand. One of them had on a sparkly purple tutu, and the other was naked. One of these girls was Solomon and Methuselah's sister, Zawadi, which is Swahili for gift, and the other was a niece. A small boy ran around us in circles wearing blue shorts and clutching a green T-shirt. This was their brother, Ombeni. Prayer. Solomon and I were still sorting through the question of which children were his siblings and which were his nieces and nephews when his father, Kiza, entered the kitchen. Kiza was a dignified man of 52, wearing a navy-collared shirt and navy trousers. He studied my face intently as he said hello. Almost immediately, the doorbell rang, and we were joined by the interpreter I'd hired. Julius was from Sudan. He recognized Solomon's father right away, though, because he had translated for the family at a recent visit to a medical clinic. The 2 men greeted each other warmly in Swahili. All of us sat down at the kitchen table, and Solomon's mother brought over a tall plastic pitcher filled with some type of reddish-purple semi-liquid substance. I was puzzled. Julius exclaimed in happy recognition. And then he explained to me this was a Congolese version of porridge made out of millet. Bea poured the porridge into coffee mugs and handed one to each of us. Apparently, Congolese people drank their cereal. "Do you have this every day?" I asked Solomon. "Not every day," he exclaimed in surprise. And that's when I understood his mother had made something special because they had a visitor. I told Kiza he should be proud of his sons. They were learning so fast. Kiza turned to Julius and asked a question in Swahili. The interpreter said, Kiza wondered, was I their teacher? The misunderstanding surprised me. I had sent home a letter written in Swahili. I believed I had described myself plainly, but apparently that wasn't the case. I put aside my list of typed questions. I was going to have to explain slowly and clearly who I was. I told Keys I was hoping to write about several families who had children at South High School, and I said the classroom in which I'd met his son served as a mirror of the global refugee crisis. And by telling stories of various students, it would be possible to illustrate the crisis as a whole. I thought he could help me understand what was happening in the Congo, for example. Kiza had some questions for me. Are you writing this book because you're still in school, or is this a hobby for you? Oh, I said. For me, writing's more than a hobby. I explained about my background and went out to my car to get him a copy of my first book. I also said my parents had been born in another country, and so had I. We had moved to the United States when I was just 1 year old. I had grown up with a green card. So you're telling me you weren't born here? Kiza double-checked. I was not born here, I confirmed. Where were you born? He asked. My mother grew up on a farm in Ireland, I began. She was one of 10 children. Ireland, said Julius, my interpreter. England, London. I restrained myself from pointing out Ireland and England are not the same thing. Europe? Kiza asked. Yes, Europe, I settled on. So it's like you were born in this country, pretty much, he checked, because when you came here, you're so little, you didn't understand anything, right? Exactly, I confirmed. We talked about what life was like for Kiza in the United States. He said he was working as a dishwasher in a corporate cafeteria at a corporate headquarters. I said I'd washed dishes for several years when I was in college, and we commiserated about the nature of the work. I remembered leaving my dishwashing job feeling greasy, and Kiza used his hands to indicate how he got dirty water all over his body. My job had been part-time and temporary, however, whereas he had no idea when or if he might find another kind of work. In the Congo, he explained, he had been a farmer, but also he had consulted with other farmers about how to grow more crops. People had come to view him as a leader. He had run for public office. Now he washed dishes for a living, a job that was dull and wearying, but he did not complain. Kiza said he spoke 4 languages fluently, Swahili, French, Kinyarwanda, and a tribal language. During a subsequent visit, I would find him seated in a chair, teaching himself English by reading a creased English-French pocket dictionary, which he said he'd found at Goodwill for $1. What Kiza found most difficult about life in the United States, however, was something more intangible, the way people in this country seemed to prejudge him. He said if they discovered his intelligence, they reacted with surprise. This had never occurred to him before. When you are black, people don't look at you as if you can even do the thing you're doing, he offered. When you're black, pretty much you're nothing. That's the assumption here. But at the same time, I know more than people think. People wonder, you're black, how do you know it? I told him I did understand that here black people were constantly underestimated by white people, and that I had visited Africa once. It's a good thing you've been there, Kiza told me. That's what the human being is supposed to be like. Judge me by my character, not because of how I look, not because of my color. In the living room, the children had switched to watching cartoons, and the clamor of their shows threaded through our conversation as we turned to the subject of war. I asked Kiza, could he help me understand what his family had endured? From conversations with Solomon and Methuselah, I knew the family had lived on the eastern side of the Democratic Republic of Congo, not far from the city of Goma. And from reading about the Congo, I understood this area had experienced more violence than any other part of the DRC. The boys had told me the names of their closest friends at the refugee settlement where they had grown up and that they had lived there for 7 years. Methuselah said he'd been particularly close to a boy named Stephen, and in their voices I could hear how awfully they missed the friends they had left behind. They hadn't yet made any friends in America, the boys said, but they were happy to be in the United States nonetheless, because life here was so much easier. But when I'd asked the boys why their family had originally left the Congo and gone to the refugee settlement, the only thing Solomon had said was, the problem was soldiers fighting. Solomon and Methuselah seemed to have a sense of mission about educating people in the developed world about what was happening in Africa, but at the same time I was conscious of the fact the boys were young, had just arrived in the United States, and were very close to my own son in age. We were speaking over lunch in the middle of their school day. I wouldn't have wanted a journalist grilling my son about things that were bound to be upsetting while he was at school, so I didn't ask for any details. Instead, I asked, would it be possible to meet their parents? And yes, the boys had said, but not during the week, because their father worked such long hours. I should come visit on the weekend. I explained to Kiza the boys had told me a little bit about life in the Congo, but I was hoping to hear from him the full story. Kiza agreed consulting him would be much better than interviewing his sons during their school day. He waved his hand at Solomon. Even my children, they don't know, he said. The elders, you know how it is. You know how to go from here to there when you're walking. You know what the trip will be like. You know how long it will take, how difficult it will be. The kids, they just follow you. The only problem was Kiza worried I wouldn't understand what he and his family had lived through. Some things are simply untranslatable. People here, most of them don't know what war means, he observed. I acknowledged it was true the wars my country had fought while I was alive had all taken place on foreign soil. You've been living here 50 years, he continued. Have you seen war? Never, I conceded. Here there's gangs, gang shootings. That's nothing, he said. Julius spoke up at this point to tell us his story. He was from southern Sudan, and once upon a time he had been a child soldier, an askari watoto. Speaking first in Swahili and then in English, Julius explained he had come to the United States at age 16 without any family members. Julius pulled open his warm-up jacket to show us that he was wearing his King Soopers work uniform because he needed to go directly from this appointment to the grocery store where he earned a living. He pointed out his name tag. It said, Julius, one of the lost boys. So, Kiza said to Julius, first in Swahili, which Julius then translated for me. So, you understand. You know what war is. The two men looked at each other, and then they both turned to me. There was a lull in the conversation, and in their eyes I saw a question. What are we supposed to do about the terrible innocence of Americans? Thank you. I could say a lot more about some of the students and some of the families in the book, but I think at this point, really, I just would prefer to open it up for questions. I've been speaking for a good half hour, and I think if you want to ask me about this book or any of my work, I'd love to more directly address what you're curious about. There is another passage I can read if you don't have any questions, but I think you probably do.
Hi, I'll start us off.
Please.
I'm an ESL teacher, so I'm
Great.
very excited. I'm only about 60 pages in, but so far so good. Very excited about this. And I wanted to ask you two things. One was, why did you choose to start with high schoolers in looking at the refugee crisis? I mean, you could look at any number of nonprofit organizations, or, like you were talking about with Denver and all the different populations that you see. Why did you want to start with high school? And then my second question has to do with your relationship with the translators.
Yeah.
It reminded me so far of what I've read of Anne Fadiman's The Spirit Catches You and
I
You
love
Fall
that
Down. and how she describes her translator and the relationship as being sort of a cultural broker.
Yeah.
And even in the passage you just read, it seems that the role of the translator is so important in establishing those
Absolutely.
relationships. So I was wondering if you could speak to those two things.
Yeah. Thank you for being here. I never know what part of this book to read from because it has different narrative threads. And I love that a teacher just stood up to ask a question because in many ways the main character of the book at the outset especially is Eddie Williams, the teacher in room 142. And he's such an incredibly humble guy that he doesn't even explain to me ever. I have to hear from other people that he's simultaneously a master teacher coaching 5 other teachers, even as he's teaching these 22 kids. Eddie is both Anglo and Latino. His dad's Anglo and his mom's Latina, and he is fluent in English and Spanish. And it's really his life's calling working with immigrant and refugee kids. I loved being in a room where there was kind of a hero I could celebrate, like this man who was choosing to welcome these students. And I wanted to portray that act of welcoming people to the United States. And I thought that, sometimes in our political dialogue, people say things like, why don't they learn English or whatever those kinds of comments are. And I wanted to show that these kids are learning English really fast. And they may not speak English when they first arrive, but the speed at which they are learning English is faster than the speed at which I can absorb a foreign language. And it's really quite remarkable. And that both these students and the teachers in these classrooms are underestimated and underappreciated in our society. And also, our numbers of students who are in these classrooms has been growing, and we have really an enormous number of kids who are English language learners now. It's 42% of the Denver Public Schools population, almost half. So these kids don't stay in ELA classrooms or ESL classrooms their whole careers. They move through them. So it's a static. It's not 42% of the school district all at one time, but 42% of the school district at some point is in a classroom like this. We don't know this. Our mainstream society is not fully aware of this. If you're a teacher in one of these rooms, you know. So I thought the act of learning English was really interesting. I thought having this Anglo and Latino man at the front of the room welcoming these students was that he was an amazing person to meet, a character to write about. But also, just as I was sitting there in those early weeks wondering, oh my God, can I write about this room? Eventually Eddie did explain to me there's something called the silent phase of language acquisition, and that as these kids are not speaking but silent, they are furiously listening and absorbing so much about English. And they have to be able to hear the different sounds and then conceptualize what those sounds mean before they will verbalize the sounds. This whole silent phase looked very passive to me. It's actually very active. I just couldn't see what was happening. So I do sort of like slowly come to understand that and write about that. But what dawned on me was just how this one room, if you take this room, the 22 kids, 4 kids show up from the Congo. That's the #1 sender of refugees to the United States. We don't even know that because we have a skewed debate that focuses just on what's topical. The next largest sender of refugees to the U.S. is Burma or Myanmar, a country that goes by either name depending on who you talk to. And they sent 2 kids to this room. Iraq is the next largest sender of refugees to the U.S. 2 kids from Iraq showed up in the classroom. The classroom mapped perfectly the global crisis. So I thought it was a beautiful way to show, just by spending one year in this one room, I could show, America, this is who's coming here. They were all gathered in this one place. And I thought there was something really magical about that. But certainly I could have picked different ages, but teenagers are really funny. I mean, one kid, from El Salvador proposes to one of the girls from Iraq in math class and draws an ink ring on her hand. That doesn't happen in elementary school, I don't think. So, other questions?
Hi, I'm also an ESL teacher,
Oh.
My name is Marianne Zare, and most of my students are unaccompanied minors.
Yeah,
And I think there are 2 of them in
Yeah.
the 22 in the room that you write about.
that's right.
And I also read your first book, and I loved both that book and this one. But what I wanted to ask you is, do you feel your books are making an impact? Like, I always feel I'm on a soapbox talking about how wonderful my students are, how many of them have been raised by grandparents, and respect is so important to them, and so forth. And I just wonder, people reading your books, do you feel like you're changing some minds? That people are more open to refugees or less judgmental about unaccompanied minors?
Thank you for mentioning the unaccompanied minors. I'll tell you one story about one of those kids, and then I want to answer your question about making a difference. This room, as I say, was very quiet. And then Lisbeth showed up. And she is this student from El Salvador who arrived here at age 15, no parent, no legal guardian, just with her 12-year-old brother in tow. She made the journey on her own, well, with her brother, but unaccompanied by any adult, and wound up in the federal court system, and then was able to reunite with her mom, who was in Denver, and that's how she wound up in the classroom. And she just lights up the room. She is just determined to talk. She really is the super extrovert. She's got 4,990 friends on Facebook, most of whom she's never met in real life. And she is determined to befriend every kid in the room, and it does not matter what language they speak. She is going to talk to them. So it's pretty soon, she's teaching the kids Spanish as much as Mr. Williams is teaching them English, and it's awesome to behold the kids start greeting her in Spanish and then greet their teacher in English and all this. But one day when Eddie Williams asked each of the kids to pick one word to describe their journey to the U.S., he went around the room, and the kids picked different words, and some of them were difficult words, and he got to Lisbeth, and she said, it was bonita. It was beautiful. And, you know, the resilience of this kid who can say, it was an extraordinary journey, and I got to ride on this bus, and I got to look at this scenery, and then I got arrested, but they put me on an airplane. I'd never been on a plane before, and they put me in a detention center, but the furniture was so nice. It was really, really pretty. And, like, I mean, she sees, like, the good in everything. And it's not that she doesn't have anxiety, because I came to understand that she did, and especially when she had her court hearing, she was very, very, very anxious. But she's just so buoyant and optimistic. I was just in awe of her. Everybody in the room was by the end of the year. And one of the teachers at the end of the year said, Lisbeth was such a gift. I can't imagine what this classroom would have been like without her. She really got all the kids talking to one another, and it was amazing to see it happen. Unaccompanied minors and how they're not well represented in our media. I'm right there with you. If you'd asked me if I thought my books were making a difference 8 or 9 years ago, I'm sure I would have given you like a despairing sort of answer, because it's easy to write a book. You pour your heart and soul into it, so many years of your life, and then you send it off in the world, and you can feel as though nothing's happening, or the comments that you're making, you can feel as though they're not having an impact because you can't see it right away. But I do have to say that I know at this point, my first book is part of the Denver Public Schools curriculum. It's used in the 10th grade classrooms. Everybody in Denver reads it. And that slowly over time, over the course of a decade, that book has had a very slow positive impact in Anglo circles in helping people understand why we have undocumented students, who they are, and just the humanity of these kids, which isn't always fully appreciated. And earlier this week, my second book was about veterans, female veterans who served in Iraq and Afghanistan and had a hard time coming home. And earlier this week, I got just a showstopper of a letter from a female veteran who had just found my book. So sometimes things take a while. I'm really fortunate. This is my third book, and I now have a following in my home state of Colorado. It's a lot harder for me anytime I leave home, and if I come to the East Coast or if I go to the West Coast, and I have to kind of struggle to get the word out like ordinary authors do. But at least when I'm home in Colorado, they can't stock my book fast enough. It's just flying out of bookstores because people read the first and the second book over the last 10 years. This book's just taking off, and I can feel the impact already in small ways. And, nonprofits are having everybody read it. I just got an email today. We want to put it in a care package. Mile High United Way wants to mail it off in a care package to hundreds of thousands of people. It sounds like some humongous number, and they're fundraising for it. The book is just everybody in Colorado is apparently going to read this book. So at least in my home state, I think it really will make a difference. They will meet these students as human beings. Yeah. You guys now you're all deputized to go spread the word. But I think I'm starting to plug into some networks, some ESL teacher networks, and the United Nations people on Twitter are tweeting about the book, and things like this are happening. So I hope, I know that if people read the book, they say, I have a new understanding now. My eyes have been open. I really didn't know before. I've had people write me notes about this book saying, I saw those kids walking to South. They're on my commute. I drove past them. Now I want to stop and give every one of them a hug. They just have had like a conversion experience, getting to look over my shoulder, spending a year in the room. The kids, but not everybody gets to be in your place in the classroom and see what you see. But through the book, people have access to meeting the students as you do, and getting to know them. Once somebody knows these kids, right, everybody falls in love with them. They're amazing kids. So I hope it's making a difference. Other questions? This is almost like having a plant in the audience. David and I were in a writers group for many years together, and it's so nice to see you here. Thanks for being here.
And I'm a big fan. I love your other books, and I can't wait to read this one. And my question is, how did the experience of this year in that classroom change the way you feel about sort of the future of humanity, or of the refugee crisis? Did it make you feel more hopeful or less hopeful, and why?
David, who is an author and a planetary scientist and a great thinker, and I are both interested in this question of becoming a global citizen, or this kind of global mindset, global perspective, and we've spoken a little bit about it. So I love that you asked that question. I'll just answer in terms of how my sense of things change. So at the outset of this project, I would have said, I'm writing about the refugee problem. I'm writing about the refugee crisis. And sometimes that language still creeps in. But after spending a year in this room, getting to know these families, this Congolese family practically adopted me, and I slowly came to understand just their extraordinary strength and how much they had lived through, but the tremendous grace that they exhibited. They basically just never told me what they had endured in the Congo. They never unpacked what was happening in the Congo because it was culturally inappropriate. And they just very gently taught me over time, you just don't ask people those questions. That's not the right thing to do. And they were so loving about it, and they fed me so many great meals along the way, and ultimately introduced me to their relatives in the Congo, and I found their relatives in a refugee settlement in Uganda, and I write about those experiences in the book. And at the end of all of that, I would never use the term refugee problem or refugee crisis in the way that I would at the outset, because my experience of these students and their families was they were a gift to me. And this whole idea that other people being displaced is a problem for us is a mindset that it's very important to learn how to step outside of. we are enriched by building relationships with other people, especially people of other cultures. If we cannot understand that, we're missing out. And you've got to forget everything the media has been trying to tell you about displacement and these families, because the media has been capturing these families only at their moment of greatest stress, and then coming back and saying to the rest of us, look at these scary people, what a big problem. And if you give these people half a chance, they will invite you over, cook you the most extraordinary meals, exhibit unbelievable dignity and grace, no matter what rude things you do, and you will slowly come to appreciate that the American mindset is not the only mindset in the world. And really, that's kind of what I'm trying to convey to the reader, and I'm trying to sort of, as I was educated, help the reader see there's just another way of thinking about all of these things. Yeah. There's another moment. Does anybody have a burning question? There's another moment I might read from. I'll keep it very brief. Towards the end of the school year, because it really comes back to this idea of a global mindset or humanity. Towards the end of the year, the kids realized that I was really taken with cognates. I really was enthralled whenever a word in English was the same in Spanish or Arabic or other languages, or eventually the kids learned if words were the same between their home languages. So they were starting to flock to me to tell me their cognates, the ones I couldn't even hear. As the kids discovered these commonalities, I began to feel as though I were watching something like the living embodiment of a linguistic tree. The classroom and the relationships forming inside it were almost a perfect map of language proximity around the globe. Generally, students chose to communicate most with others whose home languages shared large numbers of cognates with their own, and then branch out along other branches of the tree. As this took place around me, I grew to see my own position on the world's tree of languages more clearly. English speakers can easily grasp the vast co-terminology of all the Indo-European languages. English and Spanish, for example, have 1/3 of the words are identical. Similarly with English and French. But we are generally deaf and dumb to the equally large influence of Arabic, Chinese, or Hindi across parts of the globe where English doesn't dominate. Kalb was the word the students wanted to teach me about the most. One day over lunch, Shani got very puppy-like about this concept, bouncing around in her chair as we were sitting with Rahim, Jacqueline, and Mariam. Kalb, my language. Kalb, their language. Kalb, Arabic. Kalb, Farsi, Shani proclaimed. Okay, I thought, I get it. They've found another cognate. But what was Kalb? Kalb means heart, Rahim explained. This word, it's the same in all our languages. I tried to get a better sense of the concept, which the students and I discussed over a series of days. Could you say that Eddie Williams had a kalb that pumped blood through his body? Yes, Hasim confirmed. Could you ask how much kalb did it take for Mr. Williams to do this year after year with such infinite patience for room after room of newcomer students? Yes, the kids agreed. When two people fell in love, was that kalb? Yes. I left South High School thinking kalb and heart were one and the same. Then I looked kalb up on Google Translate. When I asked Google to change heart into Arabic, it gave me kalb as I expected. But when I asked Google to translate kalb into English, I got heart, center, middle, transformation, conscience, core, marrow, pith, pulp, essence, quintessence, topple, alter, flip, tip, overturn, reversal, overthrow, capsize, whimsical, convert, change. In addition, the word meant substance, being, pluck. I am in love with this word, I thought. What is all this movement about? My own concept of heart didn't include flip, capsize, reverse. Our two cultures didn't seem to have the same idea what was happening at the core of our beings. There was something reified and stolid about my own sense of heart, whereas the idea of heart these kids possessed seemed to have a lighter, more nimble quality. Whatever it was, Kalb seemed more fluid and less constrained than anything that I had imagined happening inside of me. Thanks.
I'm going to end on a question, if I may.
Yeah, please.
And I don't know if you can answer this because you immersed in one high school, but it's clear that the principal, as you say in the book, and the teacher were extraordinary. And we have some teachers here who I'm sure are equally extraordinary and dedicated. Do you have any sense of how much of a norm that is? I mean, this high school had a history of essentially welcoming refugee kids and really trying to integrate and have a holistic experience for all kids at that school. And I just don't know how, if you could talk a little bit about that before we end.
Any large urban center and many, many rural communities will have ESL, ELL, ELA classrooms, all this different terminology, English as a second language, English language learner. Newcomer centers are a little more rare. This high school happens to have a newcomer center. So a newcomer center, like the room that I was in, is specifically a room for kids learning English, also who have had their schooling interrupted. And that's why there's such a high concentration of refugee students in this room, because many of these kids missed entire years of school due to war being the main reason the kids' schooling's interrupted. So anywhere there's a newcomer center, there's something like what's happening in this classroom, and there are newcomer centers all over the country. What's unusual and unique in my experience so far about South High School is this newcomer center is inside an ordinary large urban high school serving middle class and upper middle class kids. So at South, there's a humongous mixing happening with about half the high school being foreign born and about half the high school being native born. And so in addition to the newcomers, there's other students who are foreign born. So there's a tremendous intermixing and intermingling happening at South. The newcomer students from this room, I watch them in year 2 and now year 3. Year 2, one student, Methuselah, makes it into the student senate. Year 3, this year, right now, as the book is coming out, they invited me back to South for a press conference, which the students ran, turning the tables, asking me questions about my book. And the kids asking me questions are Solomon, Methuselah, a kid named Marwan from Syria who arrived a year after them, and 2 students from Iraq who were mentoring some of the students in this classroom. So there were actually 4 kids from this newcomer classroom at the press conference, now in the student senate, asking me questions. They've become student leaders. That's what's unusual about South. It's the integration of the kids fully, socially, into the whole fabric of the school. And it's because the administration and the student body both decided these kids are an asset. They are not a deficit. They are a gift to us, and they really have embraced the idea of becoming global-minded, of becoming global citizens, and that their peers in the room with them in their advanced placement class who began in the newcomer center or began in an English language acquisition room, that they can learn as much from their peers as they can from their teacher. And I think that attitude, that mindset, I have yet to see in another school. It probably exists somewhere else, but I haven't come across it. I think it's pretty unusual. Yeah. And that's what I think South is hoping, that's what the principal wanted to showcase by inviting me there, and that's what I think she's hoping to export to more places, a different attitude and a different mindset about integration. Yeah. Thanks.